First thing Sergeant Cale Dren noticed about the alien broadcast was how calm the voice was. Not arrogant, not triumphant, just calm. The way a surgeon sounds when they're explaining to a patient that the procedure is routine and the outcome is already decided. The Vreth Dominion's announcement came through every surviving screen on Earth simultaneously, in every language, with no lag between them, which meant they had been inside the planet's communication infrastructure for months before the first ship even broke atmosphere. The broadcast was 11 minutes long. It explained, in precise and reasonable terms, that humanity had been assessed, categorized, and scheduled for what the Vreth called a containment protocol. Not destruction, containment. The distinction, they made clear, was important to them. Cale watched it on a cracked phone screen in the basement of what had once been a community center in New Chicago's eastern grid. Around him, 9 other people watched on their own devices or over each other's shoulders. None of them said anything for a long time after the broadcast ended. Then Marcus, who was 17 and had been their best runner since they lost Okafor, said, "What's a containment protocol?" "It means a cage," said Grace. "A very large cage." She was sitting on a crate near the water filtration rig she'd built out of salvaged pipe and activated charcoal. Grace never looked at screens during Vreth broadcasts. She said watching them was the same as letting them measure you, and she had a pathological objection to being measured by anything that wasn't her own 2 hands. She was 23 years old, and the reason 18 people in this basement were still breathing. Kel set the phone down and rubbed the side of his face where the scar ran from his jaw to his temple. A Vreth Lancer had clipped him during the fall of what used to be Chicago proper, and the wound had healed wrong because there were no sterile conditions anymore, just improvised ones. He'd stopped noticing it except when he needed to think. "They said 60 days, he said. "They always say 60 days, said Amani from across the room. She was the oldest of them, at 38, former Transit Authority supervisor, and she had a way of stating the obvious that somehow never felt insulting. "They said 60 days in Montreal. They said 60 days in Lagos. You know how many days it actually took in Lagos?" Nobody answered. 11, she said. "It took 11 days. That was the thing about the Vreth, that the initial broadcasts, the human ones, before they went dark, had consistently failed to communicate. The Vreth were not conquerors in any sense that human history had produced a vocabulary for. They didn't want land. They didn't want resources. They seemed, as far as anyone had been able to determine in the 14 months since first contact, to want nothing at all from humanity except its absence from the places where humanity currently was. They were relocating a species the way you'd relocate an anthill that had grown up through the foundation of a building you wanted to use for something else. The inconvenience was acknowledged. The timeline was considered generous. What they were moving humanity toward, no one knew. Containment zones were sealed with a field technology that no human instrument had successfully analyzed. People went in. Nobody came out. Some signals escaped. The Vreth's own internal communications, captured in fragments by a Johannesburg listening station in the early weeks, had been partially decoded by a linguist named Abara before the station was neutralized, and what she translated before she went dark was the phrase the resistance had been passing between cells for months in a tone somewhere between joke and scripture. They don't understand what they picked up. Nobody knew what Abara meant. The translation was imperfect. Cale had been turning the phrase over in his mind since the day it reached him, the same way you turn a stone in your pocket without knowing why. 60 days, Grace said, not looking up from the filtration rig. "We have maybe 60 hours before they seal the eastern grid's perimeter. The 60-day countdown is for the civilian population. We've already been flagged." She was right. The Vreth used a categorization system the Resistance had started calling the Register, a biological assessment conducted through the scanning, drones that swept occupied zones every 48 hours. Most humans came back on the Register as Category 3, managed population, compliant profile, low resource expenditure. Category 2 was the administrative tier. Humans the Vreth seemed to find useful in maintaining the populations they were processing, though no one was entirely certain why. Category 1 was what the Resistance had named the problem. Category 1 meant the Vreth scanner had detected something it flagged as an anomaly. Kale was Category 1, so was Grace. So as of 3 days ago, was Marcus. Which was why his mother had brought him here, instead of reporting him to the Vreth intake processors, the way the compliance broadcasts instructed. The Category 1 designation wasn't a death sentence. It was something less certain, and in its uncertainty, considerably worse. It meant the Vreth wanted you specifically. It meant you were interesting to them in a way that healthy people are not usually interesting to the things that want to put them in cages. We move tonight, Kale said. To where? Marcus asked. Kale looked at Grace. Grace looked at the filtration rig for another moment, then set down her French with the careful deliberateness of someone setting down something they're not sure they'll get to pick up again. There's a place, she said. The place was called The Well. It was not a name anyone had chosen. It was just what the space felt like. A former underground parking structure, beneath what had been a federal building, now collapsed above ground into a shape that looked from drone altitude like natural debris. The well housed the largest surviving resistance cell in the region. 63 people, down from over 100 after a scanner breach 4 weeks prior. It was run by a man named Chris McLaren, who had been a city engineer before the fall, and who maintained the single greatest intelligence failure, with the methodical calm of someone genuinely believed in infrastructure. The intelligence failure was this. The Vreth scanners could not see underground. This had been confirmed by accident, and then by careful, lethal testing over the course of 3 months. The Vreth scanner drones operated on a frequency band that was absorbed by the specific density of bedrock found in the geological layer 12, meters below the city's surface. It was not a strategic vulnerability the Vreth had left open deliberately. It was, as McLaren put it in the dry voice he reserved for things that made him almost happy, a manufacturing assumption. They had built their scanners for open surface population assessment. They hadn't considered that the things they were trying to contain might go to ground. They don't understand what they picked up. Kale's group reached the well's outer checkpoint at 3 in the morning, guided by a route that Grace had memorized, and that existed nowhere in written form. The checkpoint was a gap in a collapsed wall marked by a pattern of scratches that looked like water damage. The guard who passed them through was a woman named Idrissa, who spoke 4 languages and had a prosthetic right hand she'd built herself from cannibalized drone components. She nodded at Kale when she saw his face, then looked at Grace with something that might have been relief. You made it, Idrissa said. We made it, Grace said. They went in. McLaren was waiting for them in the section of the well that served as the operations room. 3 folding tables pushed together, covered in maps that combined satellite imagery from before the fall with hand-drawn reconnaissance from after it. He was a compact man in his 50s with the kind of stillness that in another era would have read as patience, and in this one read as someone who had run out of things to be surprised by. He looked at Kale for a long time. Then he looked at the rest of the group. Then he said, Category 1s. 6 of us, Kale said, from the eastern cell. I've got 12 here, McLaren said. Before you arrived, I had 8. There are cells in the southern district reporting the same pattern. Category 1s getting flagged on consecutive scans, perimeters sealing ahead of schedule. Something changed in the last 72 hours. The Vreth are accelerating. Why? Marcus said. He'd followed Kale into the operations room and was standing slightly behind him the way young people stand when they want to be taken seriously, but haven't quite committed to the posture that requires. McLaren looked at him. Because they found something, or they think they did. He moved to one of the maps and placed his finger on a location in what had been the city's old industrial quarter. 3 nights ago, a scout team reached a Vreth logistics depot in this zone. Standard supply run. They were looking for field rations and filtration components. What they found instead was a room full of Vreth soldiers doing something none of us had seen before. He paused. They were afraid, he said. The word landed in the room like something dropped from a height. Kale had never heard anyone use it in reference to the Vreth before. The Vreth weren't afraid of things. They assessed things. They categorized things. They contained things. They did it all. With the same flat administrative thoroughness that made them feel At a certain angle, less like an invading force and more like a natural disaster that had somehow learned paperwork. Afraid of what? Grace asked. McLaren turned back to the map. The scouts got close enough to hear what the Vreth soldiers were communicating. We've had partial translation capability since the Johannesburg data came through. It was incomplete. But one phrase came through clearly. He said the phrase. It was in Vreth. Then he said what it meant. The weapon of God, he said. That's the translation, the closest one anyway. The scouts think the Vreth were talking about a specific human. One of the category ones. Kale felt something move in the scar along his jaw. Not pain. Something older. They've been scanning for it, McLaren continued. Whatever it is, whatever they think they found. The escalation of the Category 1 flagging, the perimeter accelerations. It's a search pattern. They're for something they believe one of us has, or is, or can do. Something they don't have a category for. How do they know we exist? Imani asked. If the scanners can't see down here. They don't know about this place, McLaren said. They know Category 1s. Are disappearing from their scan zones rather than reporting for processing. And the fact that we're disappearing rather than presenting ourselves. He paused. That's what's scaring them. The silence in the room had a different texture after that. What's the weapon of God? Marcus said. Nobody answered him. Kale was looking at Grace, and Grace was looking at her own hands. She told him at dawn, in a corner of the well that had once been a maintenance alcove, and now served as the closest thing to a private space the facility offered. The light came from a single salvaged LED strip that flickered occasionally when the generator cycled. Grace sat on an overturned bucket, and Kale sat across from her on a section of pipe, and she spoke quietly enough that only he could hear. I've been scanning the Vreth comm fragments for 6 months, she said. The Johannesburg data. Ibarra's translations weren't the only ones. There were fragments she didn't get to before the station went down. I've been working through them. The phrase weapon of God comes up 37 times in the dataset. It's not metaphorical. It's a designation, a specific biological marker in the Vreth classification system. Something they encountered before, something that ended badly for them. Where? Kale asked. I don't know. Somewhere in their history. The fragments don't give location, but the surrounding text is consistent. This marker, whatever it is, appears in populations the Vreth have attempted to contain, navigates under stress. And the populations that develop it, she stopped. What happened to those populations? Kale asked. Vreth abandoned the containment operation, Grace said. The generator cycled, the light flickered. The Category 1 flags, Kale said slowly.
It's not a threat assessment.
No, Grace said. It's a fear response. They're not flagging us because we're dangerous. Free flagging us because something in us triggered a recognition pattern they didn't expect. Something that matches the marker. Is the marker? Grace looked at her hands again. I don't know exactly. The biological description in the fragments uses concepts I don't have equivalents for. But the behavioral correlates are consistent. She looked up. People who've been pushed past what they thought they could survive. People who've lost things and kept moving. People who've built something from nothing and then watched it get taken and built it again anyway. People who... She stopped herself. People who refuse to stay in the category they've been assigned. Kale sat with that for a moment. So we're not a weapon, he said. Not the way they mean, Grace said. But whatever we are, we've broken something in their operational model before, and they know it. And they're scared enough to accelerate an entire planetary containment operation to find us and neutralize us before. Before what? Before we figure out what we are, she said. McLaren called the full cell together at midday. 63 people in the central section of the well, sitting on crates and folding chairs and sections of floor, listening to a man explain the end of the world with the measured cadence of someone running a city council meeting. Kale stood at the back and watched their faces. There were people in this room who had been teachers and mechanics and parents and teenagers. There was a man who had been a professional musician, who now kept time during night watches by tapping rhythms on his knee that no one else could hear. There was a woman who had been a neuroscience researcher and now spent every spare hour drawing neural diagrams on paper scraps mapping the Vreth scanner frequencies against human brainwave patterns in a theory she wasn't ready to share yet. There were children. Kale tried not to think about the children, because when he did, he stopped being useful. McLaren explained what the scouts had found. He explained the Vreth's fear response. He explained, carefully and without drama, the implication of the Category 1 escalation and the accelerating perimeter seal. He did not editorialize. He did not offer false hope. He was the kind of man who believed that people could handle the truth if you gave it to them without embellishment, and who had been proven right by these particular people enough times to have earned the conviction. When he finished, he opened the floor. The questions came in waves. The practical ones first. How long until the eastern perimeter sealed? What were the options for relocation? The southern cells be reached. Then the harder ones. The ones about what McLaren had described as the Vreth's fear. What it meant, whether it could be used, whether there was any way to force the thing the Vreth were afraid of into the open before they found a way to contain it. Kale listened to all of it. Then he stood up. He didn't have a speech prepared. He'd never been a speech kind of person. He had the thing. He'd learned, in 14 months of watching people disappear into containment zones and watching other people refuse to follow them, a particular kind of clarity about what mattered and what was noise. They're afraid of something they found in us before, he said, and they're accelerating to contain it because they know what it does when it gets loose. So here's what I think. He paused. I think we stop hiding from the scan. The room went quiet in a way that was different from ordinary quiet. I think we let them find the Category 1s, he said. All of us, concentrated. I think we let them see exactly what they're afraid of in one place, one time, and I think we find out together what it is we can do. That's a suicide mission, someone said. Not unkindly, just accurately. Maybe, Kale said. But the Vreth abandoned a containment operation before when they encountered this. They didn't fight it. They left. So, either there's something we can do that makes them leave again, or there isn't. He looked around the room. At Marcus, who was watching him with the focused intensity of someone deciding whether to believe in something. At Amani, who had her arms crossed, and her expression settled into the particular configuration she wore when she was thinking past the obvious objection. At Grace, who was looking at him with something he couldn't quite name, and didn't try to. If there isn't, we're in a cage either way. At least this way we know what we were. Nobody spoke for a long time. Then the musician tapped something on his knee. A rhythm. Simple 4/4, the kind of beat you could walk to. Others felt it before they understood it. And one by one, people began to nod. It took 4 days to prepare. McLaren managed the logistics with the focus of a man who had spent 30 years making things work that should not have worked, and he threw all of it at this. The Category 1s, 20 now between the eastern cell arrivals and the ones already in the well, were pulled together for a series of sessions that felt less like military briefings, and more like the kind of conversation you have at 3 in the morning when pretense of having answers has dissolved, and all you can do is be honest. Grace ran the sessions. She shared everything from the Vreth comm fragments. She shared the behavioral correlates she'd identified for the marker, the accumulated weight of surviving what you weren't supposed to survive, the specific human quality of building and rebuilding, and refusing to accept the permanence of loss. She shared the parts she didn't understand, and the parts that scared her, and the part she'd been holding back, was that the fragments suggested the marker was contagious, not biologically, not like a virus, like an idea. Populations where the Vreth abandoned the operation, she said. The marker didn't stay contained to the individuals who first triggered the scan flags. It propagated. The Vreth communication about it describes a spreading, a kind of resonance through the population, like one tuning fork setting off another. She paused. I think that's the real weapon, not any one of us. The thing one of us can start, that all of us can carry. What does it do? Idrissa asked. She had her prosthetic hand on the table in front of her, fingers spread, the way she sometimes placed it when she was concentrating. I don't know exactly, Grace said, but the fragments describe the Vreth's operational systems experiencing something they classify as resonance interference when it propagates. Their scanner frequencies. The ones they use for the register start returning corrupted data. The categorization system breaks down. They can't assess, they can't contain, they can't process. She looked around the table. Their entire presence on this world is built on the ability to categorize us, to see us clearly and put us in the right box. If that breaks down, they have nothing, McLaren said. They have nothing, Grace confirmed. Cale was quiet through most of this. He was thinking about a thing that had happened to him during the fall of Chicago proper. A moment he hadn't told anyone about because there wasn't a language for it, and because the telling would have required him to sound like a person describing a dream. It had been at the worst of it, in the streets, when the Lancer had clipped his jaw and he'd gone down, and there had been a moment, very brief, less than a second, when he'd felt something in him decide, not to survive, not to fight, just to refuse. To deny the thing trying to put him in a category, any category at all, and the Lancer had moved on. He hadn't thought about it in terms of the Vreth sphere. He'd thought about it in terms of adrenaline and luck. Sitting in this basement, listening to Grace describe resonance propagation and tuning forks. He was thinking about it differently. How do we start it? He asked. Grace looked at him. I think you already know, she said. They chose dawn. Not for symbolism. Dawn was when the Vreth scanner drones completed their overnight cycle and returned to their depot hubs for recharge. Gave a window of approximately 22 minutes before the next wave launched. 2 minutes in which the Category 1 concentrations would appear on the Vreth's passive tracking systems as an anomaly cluster, rather than an active scan event. 22 minutes to make enough noise to be found. The location was the roof of the collapsed federal building, the surface, directly above the well. The rubble had been assessed by McLaren's engineering instincts as stable enough for 20 people standing still, and unstable enough that the Vreth would not have stationed ground assets there. It was exposed. It was visible. It was the opposite of everything they'd been doing for months. They climbed out through the maintenance shaft at 4:50 in the morning. The sky above New Chicago was the particular shade of gray that precedes dawn. Not light yet, but the darkness beginning to lose its conviction. Cale went first. The rubble was cold and irregular under his hands as he pulled himself up and out into the open air for the first time in 4 days. He stood up. The wind came off the lake. It always came off the lake. The lake was the only thing that still moved the way it had before. Massive and indifferent and continuous. He faced it. The others came up behind him. 20 people, in various states of cold and exhaustion, and the specific alertness of people who have prepared for something, and are now inside the preparation. Marcus came up last and stood near Cale, looking at the skyline, the parts of it that still made a skyline, and the dark gaps where buildings had been. What do we do? Marcus said. We stand here, Cale said. And we don't be something they can put in a box. Marcus looked at him. How do you do that? Cale thought about the moment in the street, the Lancer, the decision, He stopped. You know the thing you were before all this? The specific thing? Not human in general, you, specifically. I was a kid who fixed bikes. Be that, Cale said. He didn't say it like an order. He said it the way you say something when you've just understood it yourself. Grace moved to stand next to him. She didn't say anything. She reached into her jacket and pulled out a small wrench, the one she'd set down in the eastern cell basement, the one she'd gone back for before they left. Tucking it into her pocket with the same careful deliberateness she'd used to, set it down. She turned it over in her fingers, working a surface she'd touched 1,000 times. Idrissa placed her prosthetic hand palm up on the rubble beside her, fingers spread, like she was feeling for something. The musician, his name was David, Cale had finally learned, started tapping, not on his knee this time, on the concrete beside him, with his knuckles. The sound was small and specific and completely his. One by one, 20 people on the roof of the collapsed federal building did the thing that was specific to them. It wasn't performance. It wasn't ritual. It was the opposite of those things. It was the resumption of something interrupted, the small persistent signal of a self that had refused to be fully categorized. The first drone appeared at 5:12. It came in low over the western approach, a Vreth scanner unit, octagonal, the size of a sedan. Its surface the non-color that Vreth technology consistently presented. The color of a thing that had decided light was someone else's business. Its scanning array was active. The frequency hum was audible from 50 meters. It stopped. Not in the sense of slowing down and halting. It stopped the way a machine stops when its input exceeds its processing architecture, abruptly, completely, with no graceful degradation. The drone hung in the air at 30 meters altitude, scanning array rotating, and returned nothing. Or rather, it returned something. Just not anything its system had a category for. A second drone appeared from the north. Then a third. They converged on the roof with the focused efficiency of a coordinated search pattern, and then did the same thing as the first. Stopped, processed, failed to process. The frequency hum from 3 units overlapping was uncomfortable in the chest cavity, a vibration at the edge of pain. Nobody moved. "It's working," Grace said quietly. "I can hear the scan pattern breaking down. They're getting corruption in the return signal." "What does that feel like for them?" Marcus asked. "I don't know," Grace said. "What does it feel like to not be able to see something you're supposed to be able to see?" The answer arrived 6 minutes later. The Vreth ground unit came from 3 directions simultaneously, a coordination pattern the Resistance had documented as a high-priority asset, Trevel formation, used when the asset was considered too valuable to approach from a single vector. 12 soldiers in their environment suits, the suits the color of the drones, moving with the fluid efficiency that the Vreth brought to physical operations. They reached the perimeter of the rubble field and stopped. They looked up at the 20 humans on the roof, and the humans looked back at them. This was the moment Kale had been unable to plan for, because planning required language and this didn't have one. He knew only what he'd felt in the street with the Lancer, the specific quality of refusing to be a category. He held it. He didn't perform it or project it. He just held it. The way you hold something you've carried long enough that it's become part of how your hands. The Vreth commander, distinguishable by the additional sensor array on its suit, raised what served it as a hand, not toward the humans, toward its own soldiers. The signal was one Kale had never seen before. Not a containment order, not a retrieval formation command. Translation software on the tablet McLaren had pressed into Kale's jacket pocket before they'd climbed out. A jury-rigged device running Grace's partial translation framework gave him one word, stuttering and uncertain: withdraw. The 12 soldiers took 3 steps back. The drones above began to oscillate. A motion the manual described as consistent with sensor system conflict. 2 incompatible datasets were being processed simultaneously. "It's propagating," Grace said. Her voice was very controlled. "The resonance. It's going beyond us. The drones are picking it up from the drones." She paused. "It's in their network." "Their network," Kale said. "Their scanner network. The register. Every scan the drones are conducting across the city right now is running through the same processing architecture. If the corruption propagates through the network." "Every scan fails," McLaren said. He had appeared at the maintenance shaft and was standing half out of it, half in, watching the Vreth soldiers below with the expression he reserved for things that were working when they shouldn't have been. "They can't see anyone," he said. "The whole city, the whole register, every category. Every contained population, they lose the ability to see who's who." Below them, the Vreth commander made another signal. This one the tablet translated with slightly more confidence. 2 words, all units, and then return. What happened over the next 6 hours was the kind of thing that history books, when history books existed again, struggled to describe because it lacked a single moment of climax. It was instead a cascade. The breakdown of the Vreth's categorization, architecture spreading through their scanner network, the way a signal propagates through a medium when the medium is the right one for it. The Resistance learned it in fragments through the radio communications of Vreth units relaying status to each other with increasing urgency. The translation was imperfect. The picture it built was not. The register was failing across all sectors. Not just New Chicago. The failure was propagating through the network architecture that connected scanner units across the continent, and as it propagated, it was carrying the resonance signal with it. The thing that was not a weapon in any sense the Vreth had a word for, the thing that 20 people on a rooftop had generated simply by being specifically themselves in the same place at the same time. The Vreth operational model had been built on the assumption that the things being contained could be seen, categorized, assessed, processed. The entire architecture of the containment operation, the register, the containment zones, the scanner networks, processing protocols, ran on the ability to see humanity clearly and sort it into its appropriate slots. When that failed, they had nothing, not because humans were more powerful, not because they'd built a weapon, or cracked a code, or found a strategic vulnerability, because they were specifically themselves, in a way that the Vreth's model of them couldn't contain. They don't understand what they picked up. Ibarra's translation. The phrase Kale had been turning in his pocket for months. He understood it now. The Vreth had picked up a species they'd assessed as low resource, manageable, containable, a species that fit cleanly into the categories they'd developed across centuries of administering lesser civilizations into their slots. What they hadn't understood was the thing that happened to humans under pressure. The way the category you put them in became the thing they refused to be. The way loss became stubbornness, and stubbornness became a kind of signal, and a signal in the right network became a frequency that broke everything it touched. At 11:43 in the morning, the first Vreth transport lifted from what had been the Chicago processing center. By mid-afternoon, 17 more had followed from locations across the region. By evening, Tattern was clear to every resistance cell that still had communication capability. The Vreth were not withdrawing to regroup. They were withdrawing because the operation had become, in their assessment, unworkable. They were leaving. The well celebrated the way starving people celebrate, with a specific and unsentimental joy, the kind that doesn't require props, because the feeling itself is the whole of it. Someone found a bottle of something that had been saved for a purpose, and this was the purpose. David played something on a section of pipe that, through some miracle of acoustics in the underground space, sounded almost like what it was trying to be. Kale sat apart from it for a while, because he wasn't glad. He was, in a way so thorough it was almost structural, the way a building is glad when the thing pressing against its walls is removed. But there was something he needed to sit with first. Found him in the maintenance alcove. She sat on the bucket again. He was on the pipe again. The light flickered. "You knew," he said. "Before we went up there, you knew it would work." "I knew it might work," she said. The fragment suggested it had worked before. "I didn't know we were the right population. The marker has to be genuinely present, not performed." "How do you know it wasn't performed?" She looked at him steadily. "Were you performing?" He thought about the wind off the lake, about the wrench in her hand, about Marcus's hands that fixed bikes, about David's knuckles on the concrete. "No," he said. "Then it wasn't performed," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "What happens now?" "They'll come back. Or they'll send something else. They're not going to accept that they lost a planetary containment operation to 20 people standing on a roof." "No," Grace said. "But they're going to have to figure out a different approach. And every approach they take that involves categorizing us is going to run into the same problem. You can't contain something you can't see. And you can't see something that keeps refusing to be what you expect it to be. That's not a permanent solution," Kale said. "No," Grace said. "It's a head start." She said it matter-of-factly, without hope as performance. "Just, this is what we have and this is what we'll use. And that's what humans do with things. They use them." Kale looked at the scar on the back of his hand. A different one from the jaw, smaller, the first month, when he'd still been making the kinds of mistakes that leave small scars. He'd earned the jaw scar, not knowing what he was doing. He'd been earning every scar since then on purpose, more or less. "The southern cells," he said, "and the ones further out. They need to know about the resonance, about the marker, about what we found." "I know," Grace said. "We need to reach them." "I know," Grace said again. She reached into her jacket pocket and produced a folded piece of paper. She set it on the crate between them. It was a map. Hand-drawn, the detail obsessive and exact, in the style of someone who has been making maps of underground spaces for months because someday she was going to need to get somewhere. "I've been thinking about the route." Kale looked at the map, then he looked at her. She was already picking up the wrench. They left the next morning. 17 of them, Kale, Grace, Marcus, Imani, Idrissa, David, and 11 others who had skills that would carry past the city's edge. McLaren stayed with the well and the 46, who remained there. They said goodbye the way the well-practiced say goodbye to each other. Directly, briefly. The performance heaviness of people who are not sure if they'll see each other again. They had all long since stopped being unsure of that. You might not see each other again. You did the thing anyway. The city's edge came 3 hours into the walk, at a point where the Vreth perimeter field had been in place, and was now not. Field technology left a residue in the air. A faint static pressure, the ghost of a boundary, but the boundary itself was gone, drawn with the units that had maintained it. On the other side of the ghost perimeter, the world that existed before existed again, sort of. Trees that had grown without the regular disruption of scanner drone passes. Roads that had been roads before they became routes, and then routes before they became the only paths left. The distance ahead was significant, and the specifics of it were uncertain, and what waited at the end of it was not guaranteed to be better or safer, or anything except more of the same problem approached from a new angle. Marcus walked next to Kale for the first hour without saying anything. Then, "Do you think they're really gone?" "For now," Kale said. "And after now we'll have more information than we have now," Kale said. "And the information we'll have is that this worked. And whatever they come back with, we'll know that the thing we did is something we can do again." "Is it enough?" Marcus said. Kale thought about the Vrethingsmanger's hand signal. The signal that had meant withdraw. Thought about what it cost, something that had been winning on every front, across an entire planet, to give that signal. Thought about what they were actually afraid of. Not a weapon, not a power, not a tactical advantage. A species that kept being specifically itself no matter what category you tried to put it in. "For today," he said. "Yeah, it's enough for today." The road ahead curved into tree cover and disappeared. Grace was at the front of the column with the map, taking the route with the calm certainty of someone who has been thinking about this path for months. Idrissa walked beside her, prosthetic hand catching the morning light. David had found a rhythm in his footsteps that everyone around him had unconsciously matched, the way you match the pace of someone who knows where they're going. Kale walked into the tree cover and did not look back. Behind them, in the ruins of New Chicago, the lake moved the way it had always moved. Massive and continuous and entirely indifferent to the categories that things tried to put on it. The scanner drones would return eventually. New architecture would be proposed. New approaches would be designed by minds that had been classifying species for longer than human history had been keeping records. They would find every time that the category kept slipping. That the thing they were trying to contain had a habit of refusing containment in ways that broke the very tools of containing. That the species they had assessed as low resource and manageable had a specific and maddening tendency, when pressed, to become specifically itself in ways their models could not predict. You couldn't put a name to it that was quite right. Stubbornness was close. Refusal was close. The Vreth would eventually build new terminology for it, the way you build new tools for problems that break your old ones. But the humans had a word for it already. They'd had it for as long as they'd had words for anything. It wasn't heroism. It wasn't defiance exactly. It was something quieter and more durable than either. It was just that when you put a human in a corner and told them what they were, they looked back at you with the steady certainty of someone who has already decided what they are, and none of the words you were using were quite right. And the gap between your words and the reality of them was where everything you thought you knew went wrong. The trees closed around them, the road continued. David tapped a rhythm on his thigh. They walked.